following a blitz by the Russian army taking over 12 villages. Vladimir Putin showed up in military uniform.
Our goal is the ultimate defeat of the enemy who's entrenched in our territory in the Kursk region as soon as possible. That continues to fight here and to fully liberate the territory of the Kursk region.
We had this 30-day ceasefire announced. The ball is in Russia's court, as Trump and Rubio have been saying. Vladimir Putin goes to Kursk following these major successful operations there that are driving the Ukrainians out. What's your reaction to all of this?
First of all, we need to point out that the Russians have never allowed the political calendar to get in the way of military operations. Never once has Russia set an artificial date. We need to do X by this date. We need to do Y by this date. We need to do X to achieve political impact by this date. The Russians have been consistent from the very beginning of the special military operation that, what happens on the ground militarily is driven by military objectives. And those objectives are accomplished as it happens. So I don't think there's any connection between Vladimir. If Rubio and Waltz hadn't met in Saudi Arabia, Vladimir Putin would still be showing up in Kursk in a military uniform. This is about the liberation of Russian territory, sacred Russian territory. And, this is about sending a signal to Ukraine and the world, independent of whatever negotiations are taking place, that Russia is serious about this. There will be consequences for Ukraine. Putin ordered Gerasimov to continue operations following the liberation of Kursk to build a buffer zone, a security buffer zone in Ukraine, separating Ukraine from Russia. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing as this conflict continues, as Russia continues to defeat the Ukrainian military, drive them back, as Russia achieves its borders. Russia will continue the assault into what Russia acknowledges to be Ukrainian territory to establish buffer zones. Russia will never again allow Ukraine the opportunity to fire shells from Ukrainian soil that impact Russia. Putin's warned about this from the very beginning, and this is the reality. Welcome to Russian negotiations 101. The Russians have said that whatever happens on the negotiating table, it has to be related to the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that the Russian terms are quite specific. The totality of constitutional Russia will be Russian. There's no negotiation. There's no, territorial swap. There's no holding on to a piece of Russia to get this. All of Russia is Russia, and all of Russia includes Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea, and Kursk, by the way. And at the end of the day, once this territory there will be a demilitarized zone in Ukraine, and only Ukraine. Russia will not demilitarize. I don't know what anybody else thinks is going to happen, but Russian troops will be on Russian soil. There will be no pulling back. There will be Russia will protect Russia. Ukraine, the defeated nation, will have to make these concessions. It's just the reality of it. And the longer Ukraine holds out, the more stark the reality will become. But Russia's not doing this to get the upper hand at the negotiating table. These military operations were defined by military objectives that were established by Russia well before the current round of negotiations began. And Russia's been consistent from day one as to what these objectives are. Neutrality for Ukraine, demilitarization, denazification. End of story.
And that's a message in and of itself, though, isn't it, Scott? Because some have noted that Vladimir Putin just showing up in a military uniform, it might be coincidental. It might have nothing to do with this announcement of the third-day ceasefire, but it's significant because throughout this whole duration of the conflict, Putin has not been donning military gear. He has not been using ploys like the sweaty sweatshirt, as Pepe Escobar calls Zelensky, always wearing that sweatshirt, never wearing any attire worth the professionalism of a politician. What do you make of this? Do you find that there is any message sent here, even if it isn't about the negotiations, though, you said to the entire world, but do you find that this might be a message to the United States, the collective West, those who are at the root cause of this conflict?
I don't think Russia's in the business of sending messages to the United States or Europe. Vladimir Putin is the leader of the Russian nation, and Vladimir Putin sends messages to the Russian people. And the point he's trying to make to the Russian people is that we are at war. We don't call it a war, but it's a warlike situation. Mother Russia was invaded and occupied by terrorists. And that's the one thing that he pointed out today, is that every Ukrainian soldier captured in Kursk will be treated as a terrorist because there isn't a state of war. This is a special military operation. I always get a kick out of watching people react to that. It's not, that's just a made up Russian term. No, it's a real Russian term, and it has real legal consequences. If I just ask people to remember, if you think Russia's at war with Ukraine, go visit Kiev and walk around. And take a look and say, wait a minute, it's an intact city. There's parties taking place. Russia's not at war with Kiev, because if Russia was at war with Kiev, Kiev wouldn't exist. Neither would any other major Ukrainian urban area. Russia's not at war. It's a special military operation, which is designed to protect the Russian people of the Donbass and of Novorossiya from the predations of the Banderists, the right sector, the ultranationalists, these murderous thugs, rapists who came in and sought to ethnically cleanse and culturally commit cultural genocide against the Russian people. And Vladimir Putin has made it clear that he is the president of the Russian nation, not the federation, the Russian nation. The Russian nation is the Russian people. The Russian people are defined not by geographic borders, but by shared heritage, culture, religion, etc. And the Russians of the Ukraine are protected by Donald Trump, by Vladimir Putin. This is what's happening right now. And he is the president of the Russian people, the Russian nation, and he's sending a signal that you violate Russia, you pay a price. Oh, by the way, he made it clear that mercenaries aren't protected by the Geneva Convention. Neither apparently are UAV operators. You know, those Ukrainians that run around, hunt down wounded Russians and murder them live on TV, then put them on the Telegram channel. Apparently in Kursk right now, when the Russians capture a UAV unit, they're executed on the site. I'm not condemning this. I'm not condoning this. Can't really condemn it either. These are murderers. When you come on Russian soil, you're not a soldier. You're a terrorist. And when you're a terrorist using, suicide drones to hunt down wounded people and assassinate them, to murder people, to murder civilians, you aren't protected by the Geneva Convention. And this is the reality that we're dealing with here. This isn't some people think this is a game. Some people think this is a ploy. Some people think this is life and death. And Russia's making it clear that it is a life and death situation. And Vladimir Putin is showing the Russian people just how serious he takes this situation. They're in the end game of this conflict. It's not a time to get soft. It's not a time to let up. Just because people are talking about the potential of peace doesn't mean that you quit. And I think putting that uniform on is a signal to the Russian people. I am the leader of Russia. I am the wartime leader. I am the commander in chief. Therefore, I will dress like the commander in chief on this occasion. Where am I making military decisions and giving orders to the troops that I command?
While Russia is focusing on Russia, as you said, a prominent Australian media outlet, The Conversation, talking about why Russia's armed forces have proven resilient in the war in Ukraine. They say few analysts would argue today Ukraine is winning the war. Russia has the upper hand militarily, even if it's not translating to dramatic battlefield successes. Talk about what actually is happening right now in the battlefield that is shaping the reality of negotiations right now.
Well, we're looking at the culmination of years of effort. I mean, this war has been a conflict in transition. It started out, phase one was I guess we can call it the shock and awe phase of the conflict, which was designed to put significant pressure on Ukraine to compel Ukraine to the negotiating table. That was the purpose. It wasn't a 3-day blitz to take Kiev. The only people that talked about Kiev following that time period were the director of the CIA, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Scott Ritter. Because I think we all believed that Russia was going to war against Ukraine, an honest to God war, the kind of war where you kill everything in front of you, destroy everything. That's not what Russia was doing. Russia was seeking to put pressure on Ukraine. They weren't there to destroy the Ukrainian military. They were there to, put pressure on the Ukrainian government, and it succeeded. Within 6 days of the initiation of this special military operation, Ukraine sent a delegation to Gomel. They had 3 successive meetings in Gomel. Then they moved on to Turkey. And by the end of March, we're talking literally, a little bit more than a month into this conflict, they had come, the agreement, the peace agreement, the Istanbul Communique was ready to be signed. Success. The Russian operation was a success, except that the Ukrainians didn't follow through. Zelensky fell victim to pressure from NATO, from Boris Johnson, from the United States, and they continued the conflict. We then moved into phase 2 of this conflict, where Russia followed through with its good faith gesture, withdrew from around Kiev, withdrew from Sumy, and then began to continue its offensive operation, the goal of liberating the totality of Lugansk and Donetsk, to consolidate the land bridge that they had between Kherson and through Zaporizhia to Donetsk. And they were very successful. A lot of people don't remember that from, April, May of 2022 up until August, the Russians were slaughtering the Ukrainian. The Ukrainian army was being destroyed piecemeal. But then they got a $48 billion injection in the arm, money, equipment, training. The Ukrainians were able to rebuild a military with significant Western assistance. They moved to phase 3, which is the initial Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kharkov region, then later on in Kherson. Very successful offensive because the Russians weren't postured to receive it. I don't know why the Russians weren't ready for it. Everybody who was watching what was going on Telegram and Twitter knew damn well the Ukrainians were getting ready to launch a counterattack. They were bragging about it, but the Russians apparently were ill prepared and they got pushed back. And then we get to phase 4, Russian mobilization, partial mobilization, 300,000 men, the entrenchment, digging in, training their military. This is where Surovikin came in, General Armageddon, and he began an air campaign to destroy Ukrainian air defense so that the Russians could begin putting pressure on Ukrainian, infrastructure, energy infrastructure, etc. Another phase of the operation. And they ground the Ukrainian army down again. And now the Ukrainians, we moved to phase 5, the summer counteroffensive of 2023, where the Ukrainians built up, 12 brigades, and they were going to punch through Robotyno onto, to Melitopol, split the land bridge. The Russians dug in, defended, and they destroyed this Ukrainian army. The Bakhmut counteroffensive. And then we moved on to the next phase, which is sort of the phase that we're in right now, which is the Russians having taken the initiative, now just transition into the grind. And, the Russians had a machine now. They have a defense industry that's been fully mobilized, producing equipment like you've never seen before. They outproduce the entire collective West together. They have volunteers. This war has become patriotic for the Russians. They are fighting for a cause that the majority of Russians believe in, and therefore the Russians are able to recruit numbers that not only replace casualties on the battlefield, but allow significant reserves to be established. And they get into this grinding. Now, people are looking at the map and they're expecting, these big arrows back and forth. It's not the game the Russians are playing. The Russians right now are in the game of, we are going to wear down the Ukrainians along the totality of the line of contact, put pressure on them until at some point in time we reach the culminating point, the tipping point, and then the Ukrainians will collapse and the Russians will make movement. Now, people will wonder, what would that look like? Kursk, because Kursk is the same thing. The Ukrainians pumped in 100,000 troops. The Russians came in initially, contained it, and then they just gradually built up their forces. These aren't dramatic. I mean, they had, besides the pipeline operation, which was pretty damn dramatic. But even prior to that, the Russians had reached the point where the Ukrainians had nobody left to commit to the battle. And as a result, as the Russians grind down, the Ukrainians have to make adjustments or else they'll find themselves surrounded. They begin to withdraw. As they withdraw, the bridges get cut. They can't move. They get bombed. They have to abandon their equipment, run for their lives. They get ambushed, surrounded, surrendered. That's what collapse looks like. And you're going to see the Russians rapidly clear out Kursk and push on into Sumy. And I think we're going to start seeing this more and more along the Eastern Front, depending on whose geography you're using from a Ukrainian perspective, the Eastern Front. with the Russians again pushing aggressively. The Ukrainians are they're running out of everything: manpower, equipment, ammunition. About the only thing they have left are drones. But it looks like, as shown in Kursk, the Russians have figured out Ukrainian drone warfare, and right now they have hunting units to go out there and hunt down Ukrainian drone operators. So the second that a Ukrainian drone goes in the air, the Russians not only try to neutralize that, but then they've been an aggressive hunt to find the people operating those drones. And, just using simple intelligence preparation of the battlefield, you capture a couple of these drones, you understand the ranges that we're operating. So when you see a drone, you can draw a range arc. Then you basically look for roads, you look for buildings, and you put your reconnaissance on there. You see where drones are recovered, and then you come in and you kill them. And right now the Ukrainians are running out of drone operators. They have drones. They're producing them right there on the spot, but they're running out of drone operators because the Russians are just hunting them down and killing them. And then when you don't have a drone operator, you can't operate the drones. You lose your advantage, and the Russians push forward even more aggressively. And that's what we're seeing on the entire front.
Right as Ukraine was negotiating with the Trump team, Kiev actually conducted a drone attack, hundreds of drones in the Moscow region. It seems that every time that Ukraine is on the ropes on the battlefield, something like this happens. Where do they factor in? How does Russia take care of them? And what's their response from here? We just had a negotiation, and yet Ukraine was also at the same time attacking Russia.
Look, there's a psychological aspect of this attack. There's a political aspect. There's a military aspect. It's an act of terrorism. The Ukrainians are trying to get the Russians to overreact. It's a deliberate provocation on the part of Ukraine. And there are many people out there who are like, oh, Russia now needs to deploy the Oreshnik, and they need to do this, they need to do that. But when you think about it, I mean, I don't mean to be too crass here, because any civilian death is one too many. 3 civilians were killed, a number were wounded. I mean, that many die in an attack on Donetsk, that many die. I mean, the Ukrainians are slaughtering Russian civilians in occupied Kursk by the dozens, by the hundreds. I just think Russia rides this out. It's a non-entity. This isn't the first drone attack on Moscow, and it won't be the last drone attack. The Ukrainians sent multiple waves totaling more than 330 drones. The vast majority of them were shot down by Russian air defense. The handful that got through, a couple hit their targets. The rest, I think, were shot down, and then debris rained down and caused some damage. But from a strategic standpoint, this was a non-event, a blip. It becomes a strategic, it develops strategic impact if the Russians overreact and do something in response that has a significant impact on international opinion. I think the Ukrainians made a huge mistake, because it wasn't a successful attack. It didn't accomplish anything meaningful, and all it did is expose the Ukrainians as the duplicitous, disgusting excuse of a nation that they are. I mean, I'm sorry for all the pro-Ukrainian people out there, but hey, Ukraine supports Stepan Bandera, strike 1, 2, and 3 all at once. We don't go anywhere else besides that. But they launched this attack. There was no military purpose behind this. It was done to be deliberately provocative, which means targeting civilians, to kill civilians, to get Russia to overreact. Ukraine can't be trusted. And that's the other signal that's being sent out there, is that Ukraine's not an honest broker here, not an honest player, not an honest negotiator. They're as dishonest and disingenuous as the day is long. And I think Russia is going to use that to their advantage. This is not going to turn out to be a positive for Ukraine. In fact, this attack on Moscow using these drones is going to turn out to be one of the bigger negatives for Ukraine. It's going to come back and haunt them in spades as this negotiation goes on, because everybody now has seen the truth about Ukraine. And we see it over and over again. Zelensky coming out after the negotiators agreed to the ceasefire, knowing full well that the United States made it clear to Ukraine that there will be territorial concessions that have to be made. And Zelensky coming out immediately saying there will be no terror. He just basically made null and void whatever commitments were made in Riyadh, which is, again, why the Russians haven't said anything. They're like, we're going to wait for the Americans to come and tell us what's going on before we react to anything. And meanwhile, Zelensky's opened his mouth and he's just destroyed, the very essence of Ukraine's negotiating position by telling the United States that it doesn't matter what Yermak and the others said around the table. We're not ever going to give up any territory. Well, that means you didn't negotiate in good faith.